Well, welcome everyone to Straight Science. Straight Science is an evening seminar series put on by UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus in Nome, and also UAF Alaska Sea Grant, also in Nome. And tonight, actually, I'm on the road. There's an Eskimo Walrus Commission meeting in Anchorage, and we brought Straight Science with us. So we're really glad everyone's tuning in. So tonight's speaker is really appropriate. Everyone in the Bering Strait region would like to know what is the timing of bowhead whales right now, because fall is upon us and the whales are coming home to the northern Bering Sea, Bering Strait region. And tonight's speaker is Angela Szesciorka.
Yeah.
All right. And thanks for being patient. And she is with the Marine Mammal Institute of Oregon State University, and her work. All right, we'll mute Samsung. 1 second. And thank you very much, Samsung. And she's going to tell us about her work with the underwater microphones and what she's hearing, what Bowhead are having to tell us about their timing. And I guess I'll leave it at that. Angela, you said hold off your questions until the end. We have several callers on, and of course, callers have priority at Straight Science. So for callers, just speak up at any time, because it's terrible if to be a caller on a Zoom call, you can't raise your hand, you can't visualize yourself. So with that, I would like to say that we are, and I forgot this part in my intro, is that both Northwest Campus and Alaska Sea Grant, we are public servants of the Bering Strait region. We serve all peoples of the Bering Strait region, which is the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, Central Yupik, and St. Lawrence Island Yupik peoples. And all of us are waiting for Bowhead to come home. So Angela, take it away and let us know what you know.
Okay, yeah, great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be able to share some of my research. I have a few slides. I was just going to kind of introduce myself. Oh, but I wanted to mention my title slide, which is Pacific Arctic Wide Changes to Bowhead Whale Migration. When I say Pacific Arctic wide, I'm typically going to be talking about kind of the northwestern Bering Sea all the way through the Bering Strait and into the Szesciorka and Beaufort Seas. So that's kind of in my mind, that's what I think of when I think Pacific Arctic, but I'll get into some more details with that in a second. Let's see if I can get my slides to go. Okay, so I wanted to give, quick introduction. Many of you on the line haven't met me yet, and so I'm also very just new to working in the Arctic in general. I've only been doing this research for a couple of years, so just wanted to introduce myself. I'm not sure if everyone is able to see the slides. If you've called in, I just have a bunch of photos of myself here. Pretty much one of the things I love about my job is being in the field. I love being in small boats, especially if I can drive the boats. And I love just being able to get up close and personal with whales, as I'm sure you all would. And then the other thing, I've got this map on the right. I was putting this talk together and realized I've lived in every state on the mainland US West Coast, so Washington, Oregon, and California. And I move a lot. So I've got all the cities named that I've lived in, and basically on average, I've moved every 2.5 years since I've moved to California about 17 years ago. So I'm pretty transient. And I started basically studying large baleen whales when I was getting my master's degree. I was at this small university called Moss Landing Marine Laboratories. It's in California. It's kind of nestled between Santa Cruz and Monterey, and it's right in the heart of Monterey Bay. And I was working with a nonprofit called Cascadia Research, and some of you may have heard of John Kalmakidis. And we were trying to develop tags that would stay on whales for at least a couple of weeks. We really wanted to get fine scale movement data. And so we tagged humpback whales, blue whales, fin whales, and gray whales. And it was so exciting. We were in the field always, every summer chasing whales. And for my master's, I was looking at how humpback whale dive behavior, how different it was depending if you were in, say, Northern California or Southern California. and how that would create different ship strike risk based on their dive behavior differences. And then I continued working with Cascadia research. I made my way down to San Diego and I started getting my PhD in oceanography from Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And I was using our blue whale tag data that we had been collecting for many years to look at how close vessels were getting to these whales, just to try to understand, how often it was happening and why. So, was it the animal's behavior? Was it a certain type of time of day? What was the context of these close vessel interactions? And were blue whales trying to get out of the way, or were they just, kind of used to the ships in that area? And so that was a major part of my PhD. And then another part, I was using underwater microphones to study blue whale migration patterns off Southern California. And I was looking at how it related to things like prey availability. So was there enough food? What was the sea surface temperature like? And was that driving some of their migration patterns? And I have always loved bowhead whales. I just thought they were the coolest. And so I jumped on an opportunity I had to write a proposal to, my funding is from NSF's Office of Polar Programs. And I wrote my proposal to use passive acoustics to study bowhead whale migration in the Pacific Arctic, and to work with Dr. Kate Stafford, who is at the Marine Mammal Institute at Oregon State University. And before that, she was at the University of Washington, and I'm sure a lot of you know her name as well. So that's kind of how I got where I'm at now. And I will start talking about one of my favorite topics, which is, if you've guessed from how much I've moved around, is migration. Every major animal taxa group migrates. It's really evolved independently in birds, bats, invertebrates, fish, mammals, and including whales. It can be very different depending on the species, but also within a species, migration can be very different. It can depend on things like age, sex, and reproductive status. And these differences show themselves as differences in the timing of migration, the distances whales will travel, the routes that are taken, and even behavior during migration. There are many types of migration, and I won't go into all of them, but I'll highlight maybe a few well-known examples. So there's the wildebeest herds in Tanzania. They will perform what is called nomadic migration, and they travel really, really long distances, but in very non-specific directions. They're really just in search of areas with food, so they don't care where they go. We have animals like the monarch butterfly. They migrate from Canada all the way down to Mexico, and it will take them several generations before they reach that final destination. So the butterflies that are leaving Canada are not the butterflies that arrive in Mexico. So this is a multi-generational migration. And then for whales, one of the most common forms of migration for them is seasonal to and fro migration, typically over really long distances. And so in this example, this is a map showing the various migration routes for humpback whales between their lower latitude winter breeding grounds and the higher latitude summer feeding grounds. And of course, one of the biggest questions that I have when it comes to whales is, why do they migrate at all? Why don't they just stay year-round on their feeding grounds? And one theory for that is because it's an evolutionary holdover from thousands of years ago, when prey was really patchy and hard to find and extremely seasonal. There's a bunch of other theories, including things like protection of calves from killer whale predation to help calves thermoregulate, so allowing them to not get too cold in the winter, as an option for optimizing energy budgets that they need to grow. And then, of course, in 2019, there was a paper that talked about being able to maintain your skin and molt in warmer waters. But the debate continues. And so keeping all that in mind, now we can talk about one of the coolest whales, in my opinion, which is bowhead whales. So unlike most baleen whales that are found in every ocean and make those really long distance to and fro migrations that I showed you a minute ago, bowhead whales, as you know, are only found in the Arctic Ocean. And I saw a presentation a little while ago that John Sitta gave, and he called them a staycation whale because they're staying in the Arctic, and I just kind of love that. But there's these 4 recognized populations. Typically, they're shown in the map on the right. The abundance for these populations varies per population, but as a whole, there's roughly 25,000 animals, and currently they are listed still as federally endangered under the Endangered Species Act and also depleted under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. However, the population that I focus on for this talk, that's the Bering Beaufort population, or the Western Arctic population. They have, roughly 17,000 individuals. This population has nearly quadrupled since 1978. Some actually believe that there's more whales now than before commercial whaling. So it's a large population that's been growing steadily, and it really is considered a success story for whale recovery. And they're also really well managed and really well studied. So there's a lot we know about bowhead whales. So I want to talk about the migration patterns of this population. It's super interesting, and I have a map or an animation on the left. So as I'm talking through their migration routes, you can keep an eye on, this is sea ice extent on the left-hand side. And it's a little animation just showing sea ice ebbing and flowing in the fall and winter of 2009 to 2010. And so we know, from many years of traditional ecological knowledge and from many years of satellite tag data, that the conventional wisdom has been that this Bering Beaufort population of bowhead whales, they spend the winter in the northern Bering Sea. And if you're looking at the map, I have a brown area kind of colored there. In the spring, they migrate northward. They go through the Bering Strait, they turn right, they pass northern Alaska, and then they spend the summer typically feeding in the Canadian Beaufort Sea. And then in the fall, they make their way west again. They go through the Szesciorka Sea, and then they pass southward through the Bering Strait to spend winter again in the northern Bering Sea. And so from a combination of things, really, local observations, visual and acoustic observations, and long-term satellite tag data, we know that bowhead whales are strongly linked to sea ice. And we know that bowhead whale migration patterns are changing, specifically that bowhead whale winter ranges are shifting somewhat northward and their summer ranges are expanding. And I'll show you some of that in a bit. But just a few stories that highlighted some of these changes. In 2018 and 2019, some tagged whales that were wintering were more north of their historic range, which is southwest of the St. Lawrence Island, and in the northwestern Bering Sea. So they shifted north. And then in the fall of 2019, it was reported that some whales weren't even passing close enough to Utqiagvik for subsistence. And then that same winter, whales were visually and acoustically detected in the Canadian Beaufort Sea in the winter. And the Canadian Beaufort Sea is where they're supposed to be in the summer. And then actually this past January, and even now, so we're hearing reports of whales that are seen and heard off Utqiagvik. And the one that we had from past January, it was just this last January. So major changes, they're happening really quickly. The Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the global average, and sea ice is really going under substantial transformation and loss. And so, my goal was to look at some of those long-term and annual trends and relate them, migration timing of bowhead whales through the Bering Strait, the relationship with sea ice, and see if we could corroborate some of these known changes in migration, but using underwater acoustics. And so I've already talked about some of the different ways we study animal movement. I've talked about traditional knowledge. I've talked about satellite tagging. Historically, there was whale mark recapture, which was, a rougher form of tagging. There's also visual surveys. You can go out and watch the animals and count them that way. And you can also use stable isotopes. But we use passive acoustic monitoring because it allows us to track animals that are vocalizing across many years. It's really a lot cheaper than other methods, and it can be used at night. It can be used under the ice year-round in really bad weather. And so using this long-term passive acoustic data set would allow us to explore some of the long-term trends when we're starting to think about bowhead whale migration and sea ice patterns. And also, a lot of people don't really think about acoustics. It's really important in the ocean. Animals not only passively listen to their surroundings, but they also produce sound themselves. Anywhere from oysters to sharks, even the snapping shrimp and then marine mammals, they're using sound both passively and actively for settlement cues. So animals like the oysters need to know where to settle and grow. They use sound for foraging, for defense, navigation, migration, which I'll talk about, communication, and also courtship and mating. And then, of course, as you go deeper and deeper into the ocean, there is really less light available. And without light, animals need another way to orient themselves, find food, and communicate. And there are, other senses. They have the sense of smell, sense of taste. But in the water, sound travels almost 4.5 times faster than it does in air. And so when you don't have light, sound really is the best way to understand your environment. And because sound is so important for marine mammals, we can take advantage of that. We can listen and use that to learn about the many aspects of their lives, which includes migration. Now, like all baleen whales, bowhead whales are vocal. Here's a few examples. I've got some calls in the upper left corner. These are spectrograms, so it's essentially just showing you what the sound looks like, a visual representation of sound. And I hope you can all hear this. You can turn up your volume if you want, but this is what just one of those calls sounds like. So just really short, low frequency. That's typically considered kind of to be produced by all animals, irrelevant of sex or age, and it's kind of more of a social contact call. But really, what dominates, especially when they're migrating through the Bering Strait to and from their winter breeding grounds, is this beautifully complex song. It's produced only by males for courtship purposes, and so I'll play that sound. It's probably one of my favorite of the songs, but I wanted to include some more because really up until recently, we haven't been looking at song diversity in bowhead whales in the Bering Strait region. And so I've got 3 different spectrograms here, or images of the songs that they produce. And you can already see that they're really, really different. So I'll play really short snippets of these 3 so you can hear how different they actually are as well. So those are, really wildly different songs. And it's just been really interesting to even know that that's very different. And so we had an undergrad named Hannah Kraus with us this fall, and she went through a couple of years of data from the Bering Strait to really just see how many different bowhead songs. She looked at just January. So how different is bowhead song in January? And so the figure on the left is from 2018, and she counted 12 different songs. And you can see this is, on the top, it's counting from 1 to 31, the number of days in January. And you can see how the different song types progress throughout the year. And when she looked at songs from 2018 to 2021, there's really a difference in the number of songs that she counted. So on average, it's about 7 songs per January, but it really ranges from 3 to 12, depending on the year. And so it's just really interesting. And you can also see here that no song throughout the January was ever repeated. They're singing different songs all the time. So it's just really interesting stuff. So we're just starting to really understand how different song is for bowhead whales in the Bering Strait region. And so I work with Kate Stafford, and she's been collaborating with researchers at the University of Washington, at Alaska Fairbanks, and beyond. And they've been deploying these underwater microphones for many years, mainly in the kind of that boundary between the Bering Strait and the southern Szesciorka Sea. So I've got a little map that shows where that hydrophone is. And then we also have moorings in the western Beaufort Sea, and also up at the Szesciorka Plateau, so pretty far north up there. Like I said, these are underwater microphones. They're fixed, so they're not moving. So we're able to use it as a frame of reference for whales as they migrate through these different seasons from the winter to the spring, summer, and fall. But of course, our interest is really in the Bering Strait, because it is such a narrow area where all the whales and all the humans have to move through to get between the Bering Sea and the southern Szesciorka Sea all the way up to the Beaufort Seas. So we can't yet, this is just kind of a method comment, we can't yet really automatically detect all the bowhead whale calls and songs, because as you know, there's a ton of other animals up there and sea ice. And so it can be really noisy when you look at the data. So I had to just go through and look for the presence of bowhead whales. Are they there or not? And I'll show you kind of how that worked. But I looked from 2009 all the way through 2022. So we've got a lot of data. And I wanted to show you, if you were to look at the number of hours with calls per day across, say, a full migratory season for bowhead whales in the Bering Strait, this is one example of that would look like. So this is from 2012 to 2013. So it starts in October, ends in May. And I'm going to walk you through what this is, but I have the map on the top right to remind you where the hydrophone is, the underwater microphone in the Bering Strait, and also just color coded again so you can be reminded as you look at this what the seasons are. And so the first gap on this figure is before November. There's no bowheads there. They've just spent all summer feeding in the Canadian Beaufort Sea, and they're making their way back through the Szesciorka Sea, but have not yet reached this underwater microphone. Then though, once we get into November, this is, nearly 24/7 of calling, and that's all the whales moving south past that hydrophone through the Bering Strait and then into the Bering Sea. And that's what that second gap is. In February into March, that's the time when all the whales have moved south through the Bering Strait. And we know this from some research that's done at NOAA, that they're not going back north. They're all heading south at this time. And then we get into mid-March and we start to see this is whales calling again. And again, it's a lot of calling. It's almost 24 hours a day, especially as they first start from mid-March into May. This is the springtime when they're moving back north through the Bering Strait and making their way over to the Beaufort Sea. And then that last gap in May is when they've all completed this northward migration in the spring. And so there's a lot of variability. This is just 1 year. We had to define some migration metrics so we could start looking at some of these behaviors over time. And so I'll kind of walk you through this. We basically defined the start of the southward migration in the fall as the first day where we had more than 4 hours of calls in a 24-hour period. Essentially, I mean, you can eyeball it. That's when they're there because they are calling when they're present. And then we defined the end of the northward migration in the spring as the same thing, but the last day. So the last day when they're calling more than 4 hours a day. And that's what we considered the end of that northward migration when they're heading back into the southern Szesciorka Sea. And then this gap is in the middle. This is that time, like I said, when whales were absent from the Bering Strait. They're down in the Bering Sea for the winter. And again, this is, the period of time where there's no calls. And in this example, they were absent from the Bering Strait for 55 days. So a pretty good chunk of time. And so I wanted to look at what was the relationship with these migration patterns and sea ice. And we got sea ice data from the National Snow and Ice Data Center. And I'll kind of show you some of the results that showed some of the patterns in the relationships between migration timing and also sea ice. So we'll start with that southward migration. And again, this is the fall period when they're moving through the Bering Strait. So I have the map to remind you where the hydrophone is and that they're moving southward. And what we found was, as you would expect, that southward migration in the fall was strongly linked to sea ice in the Szesciorka Sea. And so we did just a really easy metric. We looked at the regression between October sea ice in the Szesciorka Sea. That's what you see on the x-axis. And it ranges from, it looks like it's about 30,000 kilometers squared to 300,000 kilometers squared. So a lot of variability in sea ice in October in this region. And then on the y-axis, I just have that start date. So when are they starting to migrate southward? And basically what you're seeing is when there's more sea ice, whales migrated southward through the Bering Strait earlier in the season. And when there was less sea ice, they could wait and migrate southward through the Bering Strait later in the season. So kind of a time-based depending on that sea ice concentration. And then in the spring, we basically saw the same thing. So whales are moving northward through the Bering Strait and back into the Szesciorka Sea. And this is also really strongly tied to sea ice. This time we've got mean January through March sea ice area in the Szesciorka Sea. That's on the x-axis. A lot less variability than we were seeing with the other one. And then on the y-axis, we have the date of that northward migration through the Bering Strait. And this is kind of opposite to what we just looked at, but basically when there's more sea ice, whales had to wait, and they could only migrate northward later in the spring season. But when there was less sea ice, they could migrate earlier through. And then finally, when we looked at the number of days that whales were absent from the Bering Strait in the winter, this was also really strongly tied to sea ice. But this time the relationship was more related to sea ice in the Bering Sea. And so we looked at mean October through December sea ice in the Bering Sea on the x-axis, and then the number of days that whales were absent on the y-axis. And what you're seeing in this is that when there's more sea ice in the Bering Sea, whales were absent from the Bering Strait for a longer period of time. And when there was less sea ice, they were absent from the Bering Strait for a shorter period of time. And if you're looking at this figure, you can see that their absences, they span anywhere from a couple of days all the way up to that 55-day period that I showed you earlier. So it's really a huge range of like less than a week to about 2 months. And so maybe with less sea ice, whales aren't even going as far south into the Bering Sea. So that allows them to kind of move back through into the Szesciorka Sea sooner when the Bering Strait opens up again. And so I said at the beginning of the talk, and you all know this, that they are really strongly tied to sea ice. But it was really nice to be able to take the acoustic data that we had and show some of these relationships with sea ice and just how strongly linked they are to the growth and the melt of sea ice. And so one of the long-term trends that I think was really interesting when we looked at, these migratory seasons, that's on the x-axis, we're looking from 2011 to 2021 here. And then on the y-axis, we're looking at the number of days that whales were absent. So we were just talking about this. Again, it goes from 55 days all the way down to less than a week of absences. So how long are they away from the Bering Strait? And really what's interesting here is if you look at it this way, in 2012 and 2013, whales were away from the Bering Strait in the winter for nearly 2 months. But after 2013, that dropped really dramatically. Now it's down to 1 to 2 weeks maximum. And so we've got this annual sea ice decline that's happening, especially in the Beaufort and Szesciorka Seas. And as that steep decline in sea ice is occurring, we're also seeing this steep decline in their absence. And so this really to us was indicating that, now whales, basically what this says is that they're in the Bering Strait in the winter. So they have to be spending the winter there instead of going down to the Bering Sea for the winter. And, like I said, we already knew from satellite tagging that whales are overwintering in the southern Szesciorka Sea, especially in 2018 and 2019, when these tags were spending the winter north of what is their historic winter range. And like I said, we also had a couple of whales that were heard and seen off Utqiagvik in January. So all of this is telling us that there's a lot of change happening in this region. We published a lot of these findings earlier this year in a journal that's called Movement Ecology. It's available online for free, but I'm happy to email, you can email me if you want a copy. I can get that to you. And we also had a really wonderful postdoctoral researcher at Oregon State University, Clarissa. She made this really nice infographic that just kind of summed up some of those findings from the Bering Strait nicely for us. So that's the big finding for the Bering Strait. But as I did mention, we have a hydrophone in the Western Bering Sea, and we have one at the Szesciorka Plateau. So I do want to kind of talk about some of the long-term trends we found at those sites as well, because I think they all play a role in the, like I said, the Pacific Arctic Basin changes in bowhead whale migration. So this is showing data from the Western Bering Sea. And really the Western Bering Sea, in my mind, is kind of a migratory corridor. They're, passing it when they're going to the Eastern Beaufort Sea to feed in the summer. And then, in theory, they're coming back in the fall to either go to the Szesciorka Sea or head down back to the Bering Strait and Sea. But what we found was from 2008 to 2019, their departure date in the fall. So when they're leaving the Eastern Canadian Beaufort Sea, basically it got later and later. They were staying almost 45 days later in this region between 2008 and 2019. So the earliest date they would leave was October 13th, but by the end, the latest date they were leaving was January 19th. So they were still up here in January 19th, and I think that was in 2018. So this really does suggest they're spending more and more time at their summer feeding grounds and extending that whole time that they're north of the Bering Strait. And then this is kind of a busy figure, but basically what we looked at was how many days that we had data and how many days did we have calls. And then actually all three sites, so in the Bering Strait site, in the Western Beaufort Sea, and in the Szesciorka Plateau, the number of days with whales present increased over time. So from 2008 to 2022, in all three sites, they were spending more time at all of them. And so what's interesting is that the years when they spent more time in the Szesciorka Plateau also corresponded to years where tagged whales were spending more time in the Szesciorka Shelf. So that's super interesting. And also their movement between the Eastern Canadian Beaufort, the Western Alaskan Beaufort, and also the Szesciorka Sea throughout the summer is something that's been seen for nearly 2 decades in the tag data, but now we're starting to see that as well in our acoustic data. And while, you know, traditionally it's been thought that whales are feeding on copepods, those really lipid-rich copepods in the Eastern Beaufort Sea, they do feed year-round. And so the fact that they're spending more time, you know, north of the Bering Strait, in the Szesciorka Sea, at the Szesciorka Plateau, suggests that there are more times throughout the year now in the summer where they're over there feeding. And we don't know how many animals are over there. We don't know if it's, you know, a certain age group or certain sex, male or female. A lot of the satellite tagging data from John Sitta suggests that most of the whales that make these mid-season movements between the Beaufort Sea and the Szesciorka Sea are adults. So it's likely that these are large adults, maybe without calves, that are spending maybe more time in other areas to feed. But there's a lot we don't know with that. And so what's really cool about this is that our, you know, passive acoustic data, our underwater microphones, are recording data that matches what, you know, everyone else is seeing up in the Arctic. So it's matching really well with the tagging data and also just, you know, the local knowledge, the visual observations that people are making on the ground. But it's showing that the changes to these migration patterns, you know, we were looking in the early 2000s. So these changes are happening really just in just over 1 decade of time that we're looking at. So it's really rapid change. And so I've got this schematic that I kind of put together that's showing kind of the summary of all of that. So you've got the Szesciorka Plateau, the Western Beaufort Sea, and the Bering Strait in an earlier year. So that's pre-2012, and then at later years, about 2018. And you can start to see how those dates, you know, this is showing January through December, kind of where whales are and when and what they're doing. And you really start to see some of those changes. And I don't have data for the Bering Sea. I did kind of include it here just for a reference, using data from a paper from 2012. But I'm sure that in the Bering Sea, these migration patterns are also changing. And in fact, I believe Catherine Burchop has data down there that she'll be publishing on some similar findings in the coming months. And this is a paper we've put together that's in review right now with a journal called Geophysical Research Letters. But again, I'll have it be open source, so anyone can reach out to me for this information, and I'm happy to share this infographic that I put together showing some of the changes to bowhead whale migration if you look at it throughout the Pacific Arctic. And so for me, what I think a lot about is, well, what does all this change mean? What are the growing threats? Maybe there's benefits. And we were just talking about this actually before the talk, that, you know, there's already all these other species that are moving further and further north into the Arctic now. We've got humpback whales, minke whales, fin whales. Not only are they moving further north, but they're staying later and later in the year. Gray whales, we were just talking about, that were sighted off St. Lawrence Island. So like there's all these whales that should be leaving, but are still there. And we're in December now. So big changes here. So this means that more whales are going to be competing for the same food that bowhead whales, you know, are competing for. And also just the physical space overlap. They're all going to be singing and calling. So the acoustic overlap of all these animals as well could create a lot of competition. And so another thing that we've been thinking a lot about is the threat of killer whales. They are also expanding northward. We have a master's student in our lab, Hannah Sawyer, who is studying bowhead whales off the Western Beaufort Sea, but she's also been looking through all of our acoustic data, and she's found killer whales, on all these hydrophones. In the map, you can probably see there's a bunch of reddish diamonds, and that's where all of her hydrophones are in the Western Beaufort Sea. And she's seeing, evidence of increased presence of killer whales. And so actually this bottom right figure just shows that for many years, she wasn't detecting any killer whales. And then in 2017, there was a couple of instances, one on August 3rd and another in September 20. And then in 2019, there was a detection in August. And then in 2021, there were many detections, I think about three and a half detections in August 28th and September 4th through 10th. So we are seeing an increased presence, especially in the late fall. And so she's putting this paper together that will be in Marine Mammal Science. So stay tuned for that. And then obviously, when you have more killer whales, you have the growing threat of killer whale predation. And so as they're moving further north and spending more time in the Arctic, we are going to see more and more attacks, I believe. These are just a couple of calf carcasses that have rake marks, and that's what happens when they're attacked by killer whales. And so, the other thing I wanted to note was that the number of harvested adult bowhead whales with those killer whale attack marks, that has also increased over time. So they will go after the easier, kill, which is the calves, but they will also, a lot of times the adults will try to protect the calves. And so the adults end up with rake marks as well, or they've evaded the kill and they end up with the scars from just attacks, but never got actually taken from a killer whale. So there's a lot of things that are happening with this that we're still trying to learn about. But one of the things that I think is interesting is maybe bowhead whales are also wanting to stay more north with less sea ice, because then they can kind of stay a little bit out of the way of these killer whales that are moving more north. This is an interesting slide. I almost didn't include it because I think it's really interesting that I was thinking a lot about well, how are changes to migration going to impact entanglement risk? Well, I do know there's a lot of fishing, crab pots down in the Bering Sea. But what's really cool is that even though they overlap with the bowhead whale wintering habitats, they're not there at the same time. So there's not a lot of risk from active fishing in the Bering Sea. A lot of it's driven by gear that gets lost. It's called ghost gear, and that's what causes the entanglements. So it's good that at least there's not a huge risk of entanglement for whales in the wintertime when they're in the Bering Sea. And then I was thinking, well, if they shift a little more north, is that going to increase risk up north, especially in the Szesciorka Sea? But right now, I don't think there's going to be a huge risk, because the only commercial fishery right now is the Russian pollock fishery in the Szesciorka Sea, and they use trawls. So right now that's not a risk, which is really great. But this might change, of course, on the US side if we decide to, engage in commercial fishing up there. So that's, one of those, a lot of the stuff is you really have to wait and see, and, obviously be aware of it and try to be involved in some of these decisions. But I was at least comforted to know there wasn't huge risk for whale entanglement, even if they are moving more north. And then, of course, I'm not saying in any of this that whales are going to, at least I don't think that all the whales are going to stop spending the winter in the Bering Sea. But they are shifting north. And so I've been thinking a lot about this and talking to a lot of people about how this is going to impact traditional whaling communities, especially south of the Bering Strait, if whales are moving more north. I was going to talk about the fact that Russian whalers, it's basically they're mainly focused on gray whales, but I did just hear that they did take one whale recently. So that was kind of interesting, but that's a little more north. So it kind of remains to be seen how the southern sites will be impacted by the shifting whale migration routes. But obviously, if whales are shifting more north, maybe the northern communities will have increased access to whales. So like I said, a lot of this is we don't know. And that's one of the things I'm really excited about to be here and talk with you all is you have more knowledge of this than I do. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to think about this and how you have experienced it. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is thinking about changing vessel patterns. So with less sea ice, we've got this longer open water season, we are seeing increased vessel traffic through the Bering Strait. And of course, this is expanding opportunities for vessels to go through the Northwest Passage and the northern and transpolar sea routes. And right now, only about 2% of bowhead whales have been documented with vessel strike scars. But if you have increased vessel traffic, that really does have the potential to increase vessel strikes, especially, in the Bering Strait and in the southern Szesciorka Sea. These are areas that overlap heavily with bowhead whale core use areas. And so I did want to kind of dive a little bit deeper in some of the vessel traffic trends, because in addition to all the migration work I'm doing with acoustics, I'm also looking at vessel traffic trends. And again, these are the routes I just talked about, the transpolar, the northern, and the northwestern passage. These are all opening up. And actually, for the first time this year, this Chinese container ship made a round trip voyage along the northern sea route. And that's because, this is a really enticing area, I think, for vessels, for large container ships, because it takes about half the time to go that traditional route, which is the Suez Canal. And also, when you don't have to go through the Suez Canal, if you're not worried about sea ice, you also don't have to worry about vessels getting stuck. I know some of you may remember a couple of years ago, all the drama with the vessel that was stuck in the Suez Canal, and it really backed up shipping for a very long time. So that's why, these northern routes are really appealing to these companies. But that does mean we are going to see shipping and traffic increase. And that's exactly what we are seeing. Arctic-wide ship traffic has nearly doubled since the early 2000s, which is coincidentally, early 2000s is, when I started looking at some of the migration timing changes. And if you look at areas like the Russian side of the Szesciorka Sea, it's about 12.5% growth in vessel traffic, only about 1.9% on the US side. Some early papers have started looking at the overlap between bowhead whale habitat and vessel traffic. And it was a paper from 2022, Halliday et al. You might recognize that name as well. He didn't find much overlap between vessels in July through October along the southern Szesciorka Sea. But I think if we start to see this increase in vessel traffic, that we're going to start seeing more of an overlap, especially in the winter, and especially if whales are moving more north. And so I've actually been teaming up with some researchers at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, so Donna Hauser, I'm sure you know her as well, and a PhD student at Durham University, Greta Ferloni. She actually just gave a talk yesterday about some of this vessel traffic research that we've been doing together. UAF have access to this AIS data. So AIS data is vessel position data, and they are able to download monthly vessel traffic. Going back, I think we go back as far as 2013. So we have many years of vessel traffic data. And Greta, for her PhD, has been, putting together this really complex process to clean up the data. It's very messy data. But this is allowing us to start looking at vessel trends, especially if my interest is in vessel trends through the Bering Strait. So how many vessels are transiting through the Bering Strait? Because I think that's where we'll see some of the biggest increases in not only sheer number of vessels, but where that overlap might increase with whales in the winter, and also things like ship speeds. As there's less sea ice, we might start seeing ships increase their speed. And so this is I just have a very few quick slides showing some of the very early results of some of this vessel traffic work. But basically, if you look at vessel traffic across every month, across every year from 2014 to 2022 in this example, you do start to see some increasing trends, especially in the summer months. I've got a little figure on the right that shows just the total number of ships that are traveling through the Bering Strait. And there is a little bit of variability, when there's things like wars, when there was the pandemic, shipping traffic, increases and decreases. But the general trend is that vessel traffic through the Bering Strait is increasing. And if you start looking at things like the month, these aren't huge. So this is the bottom right figure I just pulled up. It's a little hard to see on the axes, but this is January in the Bering Strait. And what I find really interesting is if you start at 2014 and you go all the way to 2018, the number of ships was 0. There were no vessels transiting completely through the Bering Strait in January. And it's not until 2019 that you start seeing vessel traffic actually go through the Bering Strait. And this was just kind of mind-boggling to me that in 2019, we had a vessel go through. There were none in 2020, but then in 2021, I believe there was about 4. And then in 2022, there were 7 vessels. So to go from 0 vessels all the way up to 7 in just a couple of years, it might not seem like a lot, but it's definitely, it's January, you know, they shouldn't be going through, and now they are. So it's just a surprising trend. And these are gas tankers, cargo, and actually there was a cruise ship too among one of them. So the cruise ships are probably going up to get to the ice edge so they can look at some of the marine mammals up there. And so the other thing I'll be looking at, this is kind of a work in progress. So these are data from Lori Quackenbush, Justin Crawford, and John Sitta, the tag data. They've been collecting for many, many years, and they've actually created what are called kernel density maps. It's just basically where are bowhead whales spending their time. And so they've got one for the winter months from 2009 to 2016 on the left. And then, like I said, 2018 and 2019 were some weird years where whales shifted more north, especially in 2018. You can see how far north they were spending the winter. And then in 2019, they came south a little bit, but they still were, you know, historically further north than historically they would be in the wintertime. So the other thing I'm going to be looking at is how does vessel traffic change depending on where whales are? Are they experiencing more or less vessels depending on where their distribution lies? And I'll be at the Arctic Marine Science Symposium in January in Anchorage. So I will hopefully be able to present some more findings on this. And I encourage you all to come and ask many questions there as well. But unfortunately, I have to kind of wrap this up. And I know I threw a lot at you, and there's lots for us to discuss. But basically, you know, we used this long-term acoustic data to show the relationship between bowhead whale migration timing and sea ice. They're really strongly linked. And they're really driven by, you know, sea ice in the different regions, whether or not they can go through the Bering Strait or not. We found that, like I said, migration patterns are changing really rapidly, as rapidly as the Arctic is changing, and they're doing so in just over 1 decade. They're delaying that fall departure from the Western Beaufort Sea, so they're spending, you know, more time on those feeding grounds. They're increasing their presence also in the Szesciorka Sea, so, you know, kind of expanding the opportunities for feeding. And then of course, some whales are overwintering in the Szesciorka Sea instead of going into the northwestern Bering Sea for the winter. There's so many questions. What are they feeding on, especially in the Szesciorka Sea? How are these migration patterns, as they change, going to impact not only the whales themselves, but some of these, like I said, some of those communities that are in the more southern regions of the Bering Strait? So lots of questions. And I have, you know, a ton of collaborators and lots of people to thank. I think this is only a small handful, but this is, you know, a big endeavor. It takes a lot of people to collect this data and to get to where we have, you know, what I've just presented to you. So I want to thank everyone here, and including all of you, for coming. And then I guess, yeah, we'll just jump to the questions. I apologize, this is not a bowhead whale, but it's a cute photo of a whale.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Angela. I love your graphics. I might have to go back because I'm on a tiny little screen, so some of that was small for me, but very good information. And thank you so much. For the audience, know that this is a good time. While I see you, Charlie, we'll get right on you. But for the audience, this is a good time, if you can, in the chat box, to give some love to Angela, because it is never easy to be a public speaker. And she just gave us a lot of good information on the work she does with the bowhead. And I learned a couple things there. So some of it, a lot to think on there. And with that, Charlie Lean, go ahead.
I really enjoyed that. Thanks. I noticed that the Eastern Bering Sea didn't have any shading for the winter habitat, and that roughly aligned with the Alaska nearshore current, which is much warmer than the rest of the Bering Sea, and therefore might have a different species comp. But I wondered if that carried north into, say, Kotzebue Sound, which is equally affected by the nearshore current as Norton Sound is.
Are you asking about the where bowhead whales are spending winter that from the tag data?
Well, just their general distribution. So it appeared that the bowheads don't use the eastern Bering Sea, and I wondered if they used Kotzebue Sound, regardless of season.
Okay, I would have to check some of the tag data that's available. It's hard to say for us with our data because our underwater microphone is fixed. So we only know when whales are nearby that. So we can't see where they're moving. We can only see when they're passing through. But I'm sure John's data shows that they're moving around. It's just that in the winter, most of the whales seem to be on the western side. So that's just kind of the tagged animals that they have.
Yeah, I'm just going to add in there too, Charlie, this is Gay, and Angela. The tag data is interesting because it always keeps showing that there is no use of the eastern side of northern Bering Sea. However, those tags are from animals that are tagged up north during the migration, and there's what, 17,000 bowhead, and I think the tags have been maybe there's 60 tagged animals, something like that. Do you know, Angela? About
Yeah,
over
I mean,
50.
I think in like 2018 there were 3 animals tagged. 2019 there were 4. I think
So
the
total there isn't been, anything that gets at the 17,000 trails there might be out there. So it is a note of caution. I always hear that, but there is other evidence. Shaktulak harvested a bowhead one time. People see bowhead honestly right in front of Nome. And further down, I've seen bowhead on research vessels down off St. Matthew. So the tag data is really interesting and important, but there's a lot of other movement information that hasn't really been compiled as easily as you can the tag data, if that helps.
Yeah, I thought the Shaktulak one was a gray whale.
Nope,
From my
that was
memory.
bowhead
Didn't look like it.
back in the day.
But anyway, so I think Sledge Island has had a bowhead hunting community on it at one time too.
Yeah. So there's they get around, and sometimes too there's been strandings of what looks like bowhead, but could be right whale down in on the Alaska Peninsula. But does that get at your question? We've got some others. All right. So in the chat, Dean Stockwell, and I know his microphone is broken. Is there a way, and this was an interesting question, good one, Dean. Is there a way you can tag an individual bowhead with a sound recording device? This way you could see how often a whale is singing and how many different songs an individual has. I guess this might also be a way to something voice recognition programs, or maybe you can say, oh, that's this whale.
Right, yeah. So there is a tag. It's called an Akusand tag, and it's attached with a suction cup. So you just kind of slap it on a whale and it stays on. But if you're lucky, a day or a couple days, and it records sound. So you can get individual animals calling behaviors. I would absolutely love, that would be a dream to come up there and put some of these tags out. Obviously weather is always an issue. You have to get the tag back when it falls off the whale. That's always extremely challenging. And also just the sheer cost of it. The tags alone, I think, are about 20,000 each tag. So, and I know, and we've used them down in Southern California, but the weather is very different. So it's a little easier to recover tags down there. But yes, that is a dream to be able to individually tag and listen to whales. And then the other option, there are some underwater microphones off California that I don't think they can actually identify individual whales, but it's kind of a live feed. So they can say, right now we know there's a whale out there, because they have it hooked up to a computer that's constantly looking for whale calls. So that's kind of a cool idea as well. But yeah, there's so much to be done. We just need more money.
Yeah.
Well, can we just speak up, or how does it work?
Yeah, you can raise your hand, or you can
I
video
couldn't-
yourself. Go
I
ahead.
couldn't find the raise my hand button. Where
Oh,
is it?
shucks. It's usually under the one that says reaction, but who know? No, I never know Google Meet, so who knows
Oh,
but Zoom.
okay.
No worries.
All right.
But go
So
ahead, or you can unmask yourself there and hit stop or, undo your video so we can see you. And that
Oh,
usually
yes.
is a
Okay.
cue to the MC here that like, oh, you really want to talk. So go ahead. What's your question?
Oh, no, I have a comment and a question. My
Okay.
comment is that I actually tried to tag bowhead whales in Greenland with accoussons,
Right, you did.
and and they would stay on for like literally seconds. And even though I know that they've worked well on fin whales and blue whales and whatnot, and I don't know if it is something to do with the skin of the bowhead, and they just don't seem to stay on very long at all. But people have been able to tag bowheads with bigger suction cups. The Accusson has 4 small little suction cups, and the D-tag, for instance, has had a suction cup that was like a single big suction cup that stayed on for much longer. So that was, and then I have a sort of a non-biological question, but one of the slides that you showed had AIS data for boat traffic on the along the both sides of the Bering Sea, the Bering Strait, and so on. And I was absolutely shocked to see how different the American side versus the Russian side were, and how much traffic there was on the Russian side. And I've always assumed that, there are these little Russian villages, just like there are these little American villages. What the heck is all this Russian boat traffic?
Well, I can tell you, I've been looking at, because the data we get, it's not very, it doesn't give a lot of information, but it does say what country they're from.
Okay.
And it does say what type of vessel, but you're not required to tell. So I only have a subset of like, is it a cargo? Is it a tanker? And I'll tell you, a lot of it is oil tankers, gas and oil tankers.
Oh.
Yeah.
So Susanna, if it helps, we have so much traffic, especially now that Putin is putting a real push on opening the Northern Sea route for lots of reasons. You're right. It's a lot less, no pirates yet that we know of, right? And it's a lot less travel time, a lot less salary to pay the crew, right? They're not working for an extra week. And so there is a huge push. We now have, there are 1,000-foot liquid natural gas ice capable tankers that are cruising through the February ice of the high Chukchi Sea, and they're doing 12 knots. We have brand new icebreakers that Russia's investing in that are doing 20 knots through the ice of February in the high Chukchi Sea. We have, and I just learned about combat icebreakers that the Russians are, they have the Arctic they're investing heavily in commerce. They have a big investment. And what we have seen, this year we had 8 commercial fishing vessels fishing in the southwestern and central Chukchi Sea, commercially fishing. Our ecosystem is changed, and the rest of the world is rushing in. The animals are changing, right? That's what her thing was. And so too is the industry. The amount of traffic we saw this year, though, if you were living in Seattle, you'd think, but for this region, it's incredible. People now in our coastal community see lights at sea in the middle of, January, February. That's a time we wouldn't see lights at sea. So these animals and all of us are trying to learn what this is, what this means. So it is shocking, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's true. It is true what you see there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It was a great presentation.
Yeah, wonderful, Angela. All right. And someone there, Dean has another question, and it was actually a question I had, and that is, can you estimate the range of a given whale song and or direction from the hydrophone? That's what I was asking. You had a hydrophone, look like in Bering Strait, and a hydrophone somewhere else? Or was it just Bering Strait? North of Diomede?
One in the Bering Strait, just north of Diomede.
Okay.
And the other ones are, the western Beaufort and then up at the plateau. So they're pretty far we can't use the 3 to triangulate. There are some methods, actually, Susanna might want to jump back on. There are some ways to be able to tell distance from one hydrophone. We haven't done it yet.
So how far can you hear, like if you hear something on your microphone in the north of Diomede, you
Mhm.
could say it's 10 miles away or 50 miles away or
I think
2?
based on some other studies that it's about 30 kilometers is like what we say is the nominal, like, okay, it's probably less than 30, but the maximum ish is probably about 30. But we are currently trying to mathematically show that for our hydrophones, but other people have done it up there and said about 30. So
Yeah.
So
We've been using recorders that have directional ability, so we can triangulate, and with
Wow.
those we can actually see. Of course, there's always a lot of error. Well, there is some error when the call is very far away, but still, when you get, I mean, at this point we have millions of calls. Statistically, you start getting a pretty good idea of how far you can hear, and 30 kilometers in a day with low ambient noise and so on, you could detect calls at 30 kilometers.
And there's a question. Are you seeing a lot of temporal overlap in acoustic presence of bowheads and orcas, also bowheads and humpbacks? And when Angela answers this, I know we have a lot of people on this Zoom right now that are boating in the strait recently and looking for bowhead. And let the speaker know, or let us all know, what are you seeing? Because she's going to now tell us, because that question in the chat is for her underwater microphone listening. But what are people seeing? Is it, and I don't know the answer, but is it going to match up with what she says next? So go for it, Angela, and maybe we'll hear some truth, what do you call, ground truthing.
exactly, and I really appreciate that you want that input, because from what
Yeah,
I'm seeing
it'd be
from the data
interesting.
I've looked at in the Bering Strait, I'm not seeing a lot of overlap. But I'm pretty sure that that's what, I talked about Hannah Sawyer, our master student that's looking up at the Beaufort Sea. It definitely overlaps in, I don't know if the way she's looking at the data, she's been able to say like, yep, there's an orca here and a bowhead, but it's the same months that they're both there. So it's conceivable that, even if we're not seeing both of them at the same time in the acoustic data, that both are present. And also, the way these killer whales attack, they are pretty quiet when they're attacking, because marine mammals can hear, other animals can hear them. So when they're hunting, they're silent. So, the odds of seeing killer whales and bowheads at the same time are pretty low, because the killer whales are sneaking around, they're usually only vocal after they kill. So
what about humpbacks?
Humpbacks, that's a good question. I haven't done as much with humpbacks. I try to ignore them, honestly, at least when I was doing the bowhead whale stuff, because what's getting interesting there is now I am seeing an overlap with bowheads and humpbacks, and they have similar sounds. And so it makes it a little tricky. You have to be like, wait, which one is this? And kind of look, it's only in like the peripheral. So in some of the October, November data in the Bering Strait, that's where I'm starting to see them converge acoustically, at the same time. So it's interesting.
So for the Bering Strait callers and Bering Strait people online here, are people seeing more mixing, I guess, of, since the ice is later to come? Is anyone seeing that? More later humpbacks, later gray whales mixing with humpbacks?
Hi, Gay. It's Upik.
Hi, Opa.
Know where I am. Anyways, so I do see whales out there. In fact, I think it was a couple days ago, we saw, or somebody saw not humpbacks, I'm sorry, killer whales passing. And then let's see, what day was that? This was probably a day after, so probably the 27th of November. There were a couple of whales out there by Big Diomede, but I couldn't tell which whales they were. I mean, we know we see humpbacks pass through in the summer or stick around and feed.
Yeah.
But then seeing Angela's data that there's fin whales also migrating through. That was a thought of my own. Like I couldn't tell the difference between a fin whale and a humpback. Yeah, I I can't tell.
But not a bowhead. I mean, both of those, humpback and a fin whale, they got a little fin on the back of their backside sticking up.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
That was really hard to tell because of the lighting and then,
Yeah.
the water moving so much.
Yeah.
Yep. But is there like a poster or a chart or something that we can view to probably share with the community the differences of the different whales, their different spouts,
Yes.
so people identify them.
Yes.
So there's diameters that are looking out to the ocean every day, and sometimes they'll make a wrong observation, because we don't know the spouts. I mean, the hunters may humpback. I mean, bowheads, of course, gray whales, humpbacks, but then the other whales, not so much.
So there's a good guide called The Guide to Marine Mammals of Alaska, and it's a flip book.
Oh,
And
okay.
that's a good one. And I'll put a little link in the thing here once somebody gets talking. But great idea, Opik, great idea. So you are seeing even now, right?
Even now. Yep.
Even now, humpbacks and
I can't say they're humpbacks. Might be something else. I don't know.
Something big.
Yep.
Not bowhead.
Something big. We don't know. They're in there.
Yep.
Russian whales.
There's a caller that I think is trying to. There's two callers that are unmuted. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Do you have a question?
Cheryl.
Hi, Cheryl.
I want to thank you for this wonderful presentation and all the good information. We really do appreciate this update for bowhead whales. I just want to comment that I just want to let everybody know when you played the songs of the bowhead whale, my little dog Chihuahua named Tessa was right next to me, and she was listening very keenly to all the songs, and I just want to thank you for that. She sure enjoyed that as well.
That's awesome. That's the Chihuahua Bowhead connection. Who knew? Maybe dogs understand, Wouldn't put it past them.
This is Erica. My German Shepherd was listening in as well.
That's awesome. All right.
I think it just has some weird attraction to dogs.
Actually, island dogs in the Bering Strait region, any dog that's coastal probably actually gets to hear them more than we do. They probably are like, oh, I don't recognize that one, but I've heard his cousin if they've been on the beach. There's a comment too from Jill Campbell. In Gamble a few weeks back, there were a lot of killer whale sightings. I'm not sure about now. We are having rough weather in the Bering Strait region the next couple of days, and we've been having it for the last 24 hours or so as well. We've got some really good winds kicking around. Any other questions? Let me check the chat.
I think I have a question about vessel traffic.
It's about vessel traffic. Is it affecting your slide? Was it showing that it's affecting migration?
Right. So, no, right now I'm just kind of looking at where the vessels are. And I have it would be very difficult to show with what I have. Is it impacting migration patterns? I think what I'm interested to see is a lot of the time when whales are up north, they're not in and among all these vessels. So do they even know, one of the things we think about with a lot of the stuff I've done with blue whales is they have no idea that a vessel is dangerous. So they don't know, I better get out of the way. I better avoid it. And so that's something I'm thinking a lot about is how is that going to impact? How do they see vessels as a threat? Is this new to them? I mean, they are exposed to vessels in the Bering Sea. So it's not like it's this new thing for them, but in the winter. But yeah, I don't have any evidence right now that it's affecting their migration, but it could affect them in other ways. It could be even disturbing to them in terms of breeding behaviors or feeding. So that's a lot of stuff that is next steps.
All right, and I'm putting in the chat the link to that marine mammal guidebook. It's expensive if you buy it. You know, I work for Sea Grant. It comes out of Sea Grant, but you can actually get it if you just Google that book title. There's other places and some are used and things like that. So for people who might want to need to save $1, so look around. Yeah, thank you for that. Then there's a comment. Michelle Dutro, I don't mean to speak for others, but I talked with Rafaela Stimmelmeyer, North Slope Borough Department of Wildlife Management recently, and she said hunters were reporting significant, this is up in Utqiagvik in the Beaufort Sea and northeastern Chukchi Sea. Hunters were reporting significant increases in killer whale presence during the fall hunting season, not necessarily indicating overlap with bowheads, but interesting. Any thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, I'm actually super excited to see what comes out from Hannah's work, because like I said, she's looking at bowheads in the Beaufort and some orca overlap. So she'd probably know better than I do on some of that stuff, but I'm super excited to see what she finds.
One thing I do want to mention, as a person from that lives in the Bering Strait region, I know there's a big focus on orca in the Beaufort Sea, right? And there's this story of, you know, now the bowhead are staying around and the orca are coming, and that's an interesting and fascinating story. But and this kind of gets at what someone else just asked in the chat, is that are you know, would be good, I think, or maybe people here can voice up or not, but would you check with some of the traditional knowledge you know, we have such expertise in marine mammals throughout the Bering Strait, especially, you know, throughout the Bering Strait region, of course, but for these big great whales in the strait. And it might be a component of your work that people would be interested to ground truth and maybe partner, or you know, everybody could learn from each other. Know that for me, and I'm you know, I'm not from around the Bering Strait region, but it is home and it will always be home. But the orca have been preying on, I saw your slide where it said first evidence of predation, and I thought, was she going to say first evidence of predation in the Beaufort Sea? Because first, there's killer whales have been plaguing bowhead for a very long time, and since they spent a lot more time down here in the past, maybe that's something you want to double check on what was normal.
And I think it was, I'm trying to remember where that was, and whether it was the first evidence of calf predation. I'll have to check on and make sure I get the wording right on that,
because I think Willoughby, I saw that the citation said Willoughby et al, and I think was or is with NOAA Alaska Fisheries Science Center cetacean program, and so she's been doing work in the Beaufort Sea. So I don't know what your citation was, but that might be Beaufort Sea. But just something about communicating more. We're so grateful you are giving this presentation to all of us tonight, and hopefully we'll, as you do more, we'll hear from you more. But yeah, I would highly recommend checking with the expertise all over the coast of northern Bering Sea, Bering Strait region, and into the Chukchi, wherever the bowhead are.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate that. And that I was really excited about this talk, because it is a little difficult from where I am based, just to even know who the right people are to talk to. And even having this experience is really great, just to, you know, having people that are actually there. And yeah, I'm very excited about getting to know more people in that region.
And then I see you, Charlie and Ashik, and I just wanted to point out in the chat that Susan and Jill are also commenting about the killer whale events, the high killer whale presence. Ashik, you had your hand up first. Go ahead.
Great, thank you, and Angela, great talk. Quick question about, you know, this direction of talk about overlaps. The one thing I was kind of really interested to look at is anybody looking at prey dynamics, especially prey dynamics related to this specific species? And one example I'll give you is that a lot of our work in the East Coast, we have focused on right whales and humpbacks. And oftentimes we see the prey dynamics is quite a bit different between those two species. So they may overlap or use same habitats, but their prey focus is a little bit different. Is there a component of your study that's looking at that as well? And again, I'm not saying that there is that bifurcation there, but if we don't look at it, we might not know.
Yeah, no, you bring up a very good point. And for what my research isn't necessarily looking at prey dynamics. We do have a student in our lab that she's only focusing on bowhead whale diet. And it's she was actually up in Reykjavik in the spring because she was looking at bowhead whale baleen to try to look at using a method, stable isotopes, to look at what they're eating. But right now, as far as I know, no one's kind of looking at the different prey that the different whales are eating when they're there, because there isn't going to be 100% overlap. Some baleen whales eat fish, some eat krill, some eat copepods, some eat a mixture of that. So yeah, I'll need to be a little more careful or more explicit when I talk about that competition, because it's not going to be every whale competing for everything all at once at the same food. So it just might be different levels of competition depending on which species are up there. But yeah, if anyone else knows, if anyone's doing research on this, I'm not aware of it. But again, because it is so hard to get up there, you would need to collect biopsies or poop. You can collect their poop to look at what they're eating, but it's pretty tricky to work up there and get that information. So.
All right, Charlie, go ahead.
Just the frequency of killer whale in the Beaufort graph sure looked like the frequency of salmon in the Mackenzie River graph that I saw the other day. You might consult with Karen Dunmall with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Winnipeg.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know.
Okay.
Thanks, Charlie. So Angela, my question is, when are the bowhead going to show up in the Bering Strait region? We're all kind of waiting for them to come. Are you able to I saw your wheel with how it's changed, the two wheels and the bowhead and the little copepods in there, but again, I'm working off a laptop tonight, so it's really small.
Yeah.
And it went by and so do you here we are, we're very delayed. Rick Toman, I don't know if you're on still. Rick Toman was on with UAF. He's always interested in the sea ice and climate, and he was obviously interested in this talk tonight. But the ice is very delayed coming down. I think we're at our fourth, as of about a week ago, we were at the fourth lowest for November ever recorded or whatever. And so we're going in to we're in December. We're going to be in solstice here in 2 weeks, and we have really nothing to show. Is there any, can you, do you have, are you looking at, like, if you have 30% ice coverage, what is it that are you looking at that? What is it that the bowhead, when they're singing underwater for you and you're picking it up on their microphone, what is that coverage? Is that the thing when you say ice coverage effects? Like, what kind of ice coverage? We're all talking about ice, but what kind of, is there any thought on that, or is that anything your research is grabbing at?
It's funny, I haven't thought to do that, and I love that idea, because it would be really interesting to see, basically, can we use the data we have to predict, like, what date range could we predict based on what the ice is doing? That's a wonderful idea. I'm like, why didn't I think of this yet?
Well, there you go. Go for it, and then come back and tell us what you found on that, because I hear all these people everybody's watching the satellites. Everybody's looking out their own windows. Everybody's talking, you got ice, you got it. What do you got? What's known? And so we're not right. And we keep getting not right. And that seems to be our future. But is there something the whales use as like, okay, that's it. We're going, we got it.
My understanding, and I could also be wrong, but like, they're up there to feed. So if there's still food available and the ice isn't
There's
coming,
food.
then stay.
Well, we have the North Pacific right whale, and they come up to the St. Lawrence Island area in northern Bering Sea, and they're feeding at the same time. Bowhead are feeding because there's good food in the northern Bering Strait region, is a breadbasket. So is there any chance you're hearing right whales in the fall?
In the fall, I haven't necessarily seen, but I also wasn't necessarily looking for them because there's so many species you can look for in the data, and I had to just kind of say, all right, who's here, like, or when are bowheads here, and when
Okay.
they're singing, and when you've got like, sometimes it was really crazy because you'd have the bearded seals singing, you'd have sea ice, you'd have bowheads, and you can barely make sense of it, and you're like, well, I know bowheads are here, so you're just kind of trying to block everything else out and just say bowhead. But
Right. I don't know. Are there kind of first cousins, right whales and bowhead? Do they sound like first cousins? I mean, they must have their own dialects, I suppose, but they must speak the same.
I haven't seen any song. There's this thing called a gunshot call that they think that it's the Pacific right whale, but it could also be humpback. So I've seen a few of those, but it's like you don't actually know which species is making it. So there are a few,
Okay.
yeah. But
All right.
no, I don't feel like I have enough information yet on what they're doing.
All right. Well, Angela, it's almost 8 o'clock and we should probably let you finish up. And is there any other questions, callers? Okay, there's another question in the, good night, Susan. There's another question. There was a drastic shift in your overwintering data in 2012, 2013. Do you know what might have been the drivers for this? Ice coverage?
Yep, that's what I think. I mean, yeah, there was a huge drop in ice coverage, and then that was the same period that the whales were, that's kind of when we started to see that really strong shift in the north, overwintering more north. So I think it was just that sea ice had changed enough that they were able to stay up there. And sea ice hasn't, it's getting less and less. It's not coming back as strong at all anymore. So that's really what I think it is.
All right. Anyone
What-
from the islands, Diomede, St. Lawrence Island, or the coast of the Bering Strait region, callers that have any last question for Angela? This is a good time to ask it. Anything
Okay.
about bowhead movements? Go ahead, Opik.
Angela, so, Lainey, hold on. Okay, wait, sorry about that. With your hydrophones, I came in a little late for this conference, very sorry about that. With your hydrophones, can you detect the sound of the ships? I mean, can you, of course you can, but I mean, are you hearing a lot of ships? I see where you had your hydrophone north of our islands, maybe about 5 miles, I'm thinking, maybe a little more.
Yeah, we
Up
can.
north.
Um, where that's kind of one of the many next projects that I want to do is if we know the whales are there because they're singing, and we know that ships are there because we have the AIS position data, can we look at how, the noise levels essentially of when the ships are there? That's kind of, something that is on my plate for future research. But yeah, we're able to, you can see the ships, even just looking at the data, the raw data, you can just see a ship pass through.
I know. Track the ships daily, especially in the summer. I'm not tracking them so much right now. The last one I saw pass through, I know they're still crossing through on the west side. That means Russian side. I mean international waters. And I saw in the summer season, late summer season, there was so much traffic on the Russian side, and then we had some whales, humpback whales, out front maybe end of August, and they just kind of stuck around for a while. So I'm wondering, because in the past we've never seen the humpback whales stick around between so much like they are now. I mean, they did it last year and they're doing it again this year. So I'm wondering if it's having an effect on the humpbacks, for the ships to be passing, and then they're staying in between the islands because the ships are pretty noisy, right? For them. So they're probably just staying in there to maybe stay away from the noise or the traffic.
Yeah,
I don't know.
that's very possible. Yeah, you could see that's one of the potential impacts of this increased vessel traffic is whales will want to be away from the noise, if anything else. So yeah, that's definitely possible.
And actually, Angela, I don't know if you have to go through the Navy, before they scrub your recordings before you get it, because we have a lot of military this summer in the area, and they will not have their AIS on. So, we had two major drills back to back, one US, one Russian. Both involved US waters from the Gulf of Anadyr, very close to St. Lawrence, in US waters, very close to Gamble, very close to the island, closer than any other, I'm sure, other than Diomede, closer than any other American community has to put up with. And they are doing live missile fire. They're doing ordinances. We have gunnery exercises. And then our military, so we had a drill. This was back to back in starting in like mid-August, and it ended by the time everybody militarily had finished on either side, blowing things up or whatever they do, it had been about 4 constant weeks. And, I know people were not seeing seals when they were hoping to see seals in the region where this was happening and things like that. So know that if you're recording data, then if it's not being looked at, you'll be able to, I guess, tell us how much ship traffic we really have, as opposed to what has a beacon, a publicly accessible beacon to tell you where that ship is. I'm just saying there's a lot more traffic that isn't going to light up. Our military, our Coast Guard, and anybody's military. Of course, it's nice when they have it on, but they are by no means held to the same rules that the rest of the world is, right? They can come in and they don't want to tell you where they are. They're going to be in stealth mode. So is that something you can tease apart with your data without getting into trouble?
Well, it's interesting because I haven't looked. I typically for the Bering Strait just look October through the spring, just for because I know that's where bowheads should be there. So I haven't looked at the August data. I know other people have. I can check with them and see if they've, because now I'm like super.
Come back and tell us that one.
That's the thing. If they're there doing this, it should be on the recorders.
Yes, it should. Yeah.
I've come across this in Southern California with some of our tags on whales where we picked up, submarine and sonar activities on a tag that was on a whale. So it was close enough that the whale could hear it, the tag could hear it. So, and it was like a weird frequency, and they were like, oh yeah, they're experimenting with different frequencies. So like, there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on where it's like, yeah, and they don't have to tell us, and yeah, they don't have to have their AIS data on. So I only tell me that they're.
Go ahead, Opek.
How could you? Sorry about that, Gay. How could you tell it was a submarine?
There's a very specific frequencies that they use in Southern California, so I was able to show it to my colleagues, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's submarine." Yeah, okay. They work really closely with the Navy down there. A lot of their funding is from the Navy, so they know exactly what they're doing.
If we don't have any more, if we don't have any more straight sciences after this, it's because I got a call from the Navy. Go ahead, Opek.
We won't. We're your friends. Anyways, Angela, you mentioned earlier you're interested in working or having partnership with the tribal communities.
Oh yes, definitely.
With this work, you're welcome to connect with me if you need any information.
Okay, that'd be great. Yeah, can you put your contact info in the chat, or I did put my email in the chat, but I can put it again. Or
okay, if you do that, I'll take your email.
And I can always help out too, Angela. I know where Opek lives.
I know, and that's the other thing. I haven't been. I've really only been to Anchorage. I haven't been to a lot of the other communities, so I'd love to even come. I was thinking about coming up in the spring just to be up there, and just kind of meet people. And
well, Angela, I'll make an announcement here, which we haven't made publicly. So I was thinking about whether or not to do this, but the 2 to 4 April in Nome, we're the University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus, and this office, we're holding the Western Alaska Interdisciplinary Science Conference the first 2 days, or 2nd to 4 April. That'll be in Nome, and we'll start having more. We're just waiting for the people who do the nice graphics to put something on the web, and we'll share that with everyone. But no, there is an opportunity for you to come and maybe present your data to the region.
Yes, yeah, that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Gay, is that something we can register for?
Yes, and that's what we're just waiting for the website. I have no control over who, I don't know how to make a website. So there's people that are making that and they haven't done it yet, but we're just waiting And it will be at Northwest Campus, and there'll be more information, and there'll be, I think there's going to be some donations for student travel awards to bring students in and things like if they want to present something or whatever. So anyway,
Wow.
there'll be more information about it, but I just wanted to let that little bit out of the bag because Angela's asking, oh, how do I get back up there? Well, come on, talk about bowheads to the region.
Okay,
You know,
cool.
there's a, she
I'll
might-
watch out. You shoot an email.
Yeah, once we get something more available on the web, if you type in WAISC 2024, there's like a save the date, but there's no, it doesn't give you the theme or anything like that. So stay tuned. That'll come soon.
Great.
All right. Charla, Rodney, anybody? Callers? With that, Angela, thank you so much. This was very interesting discussion we've gone over, and we're all very appreciative. Next week, next Thursday, thanks, Jim D. That's for you, Angela, the little hand clap right there. Next Thursday, we have for Straight Science, Mark Zimmerman. This will be on the 14th. He is a NOAA fisheries biologist who studies the habitat of the seafloor, and he's gone through all the data that all the other federal guys have been collecting on the seafloor. He's specifically looked at the Bering Strait, all that data that they've compiled, and it turns out there's all these features that have never been described. And so he's going to give us, it's all going to be about the Bering Strait area west of Nome, I think. And it's going to be really, really, really detailed features, the history. Some of this is, he says, has never been described on any of the charts. So I'm interested very much, and I think other people will be as well. We'll get to finally see what's on the bottom of the ocean. And I'm not sure how far down that goes, St. Lawrence Island, but definitely OPIC, stay tuned. Maybe they'll find that loader that went
Yep.
through.
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
okay.
With that, we'll see you next time. Angela, if you want to stay on for a second, we'll let everyone else hop off. Thank you all so much for coming. Have a good night, everybody.